Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on the part of the world you're at right now. Welcome to this Light Center webinar, Plagiarism and International Students in Higher Education. We are so happy to have you here. We have faculty members from the College of Business and College of Education, so welcome all. And it's time to get started. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. So today we have the honor to have Professor Solomon Jenkins as the speaker of this webinar. And Professor Jenkins earned his MA in TESOL from NYU's Steinhardt School of Education. He has been in the field of ELT, especially in Saudi Arabia, for more than 14 years. He has also contributed to academia by way of publishing numerous articles in top peer-reviewed journals. He is currently working at King Fahd University for Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia, and is also an active blogger for the British Council. His research interests include second language writing acquisition, language and identity, transnationalism, and intercultural rhetoric. So welcome, Professor Jenkins, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Dr. Eve. Welcome, everybody. This is a presentation about plagiarism and higher education, which is a topic that is that can cover broadly the College of Business and the College of Education, and really any college, because plagiarism is something that affects academia anywhere we are in the world and in any discipline. So today, what we like to do is, just 1 second here. Yeah, so the agenda is we like to first establish a working definition of plagiarism, and then analyze how prevalent it is in higher education. And then we want to start looking at some of the underlying reasons for plagiarism, not just at the superficial level, but also at a more deeper cognitive level. Look at some of the things that maybe some of us are not aware of that may be the underlying reasons for plagiarism. We will discuss what types of plagiarism students commit, and then we'll look at some strategies we can use digitally and physically to detect plagiarism done by our students. And then we will analyze some discipline, based on certain policies and ways that we think are the best ways and the best approaches to dealing with plagiarism when we do find it. So let's begin first with getting a working definition of plagiarism. So I'd like to hear from you guys. So plagiarism is what again? Let's discuss. So what would you all, I'd like to hear some responses. What would you define plagiarism as? And then also, what are some of the consequences that arise from students engaging in plagiarism?
Stealing.
Stealing, okay. Others?
I'd say plagiarism is using someone's work as your own without giving them credit.
Okay, good. Anyone else want to add to that? So stealing, not giving credit.
Being lazy.
Being lazy, okay.
I would say sometimes unknowingly copying and pasting. They do have no idea what plagiarism means.
Okay, so, okay, all right, okay. Anything else?
Professor Shayla Carwin from on the chat says, plagiarism is copying someone else's work word for word without providing them with credit. Excellent,
excellent, very good. Okay, good. So okay, we have copying word for word. We have, it seems, conceptual confusion. We have stealing. Okay, so let's look at my definition of it. I would define it as the act of stealing or theft or appropriation of intellectual property not owned by the perpetrator, in this case, the student. A textbook definition would be this one from dictionary.com: the unauthorized use or close imitation of language and thoughts of another and the representation of them as one's own original work. Now, we didn't speak about any of the consequences, but in academia, especially in the West, some of the consequences are severe. Generally in college or in high school, it ranges from failing a course to getting expelled from the school. And in extreme cases, such as the case of this German defense minister a few years ago, he actually had to resign as the defense minister. So that's pretty extreme, a pretty extreme case of what happens when you plagiarize. So the stigma attached to plagiarism is unshakable, especially in academia, something that's really not tolerated on on any level. So let's look at again some of the discourse that surrounds plagiarism by looking at a few policy statements. So let's get an idea really about how strong the stigma is that's attached to plagiarism. If we look at this policy statement from a high school, it says it has zero tolerance for plagiarism and cheating. We take these offenses very seriously. Another high school in Australia, plagiarism is academic dishonesty, theft, unacceptable behavior. Michigan State University, plagiarism is considered fraud, and there are harsh consequences, including loss of job or reputation. Plagiarism is an act of academic dishonesty and intellectual theft, okay? So if I were to ask you, what is a commonality between all these policy statements on plagiarism, what would you say?
Unacceptable.
Okay.
And I see the one thing is that, like the last one where it talks about the intentional aspect, because there's that when we talked about theft,
right?
Theft is, I look at it as something that is intentional, you know,
Sure.
versus say, like if you take a pen and by mistake, that's unintentional. Yeah, we would in that context. So there's a degree of knowledge that goes with it.
Okay, excellent.
I would also say that it probably comes with the consequences, right? So you see, for all these cases, it has a aftermath that you need to deal with.
Okay, yep, exactly, yep. Anything else? Look at the cheating, theft, dishonesty, fraud. What kinds of, I mean, what kind of connotation is this?
Unethical.
Unethical, right? It's to me, it seems that there's a criminality to it. That students who do this are criminals to some degree. Which, yes, if it's a certain type of plagiarism, one that stems from lack of ethics and things like that, absolutely, there's a criminality to it. But is all plagiarism criminal? That's the question. That's what we're trying to discuss here today. Are all acts of plagiarism, are they criminal? And we'll unpack that in a little bit. This is a very interesting policy statement from Oxford. It says plagiarism may be intentional or reckless or unintentional. Under the regulations of examinations, intentional or reckless plagiarism is a disciplinary offense. Now, to me, the language doesn't seem nearly as criminal as the other one. It seems to take into account the fact that, as David mentioned, there is an intentional aspect to plagiarism. There's also an unintentional aspect to plagiarism. So it doesn't really seem to me that it treats all plagiarism as the same, under the same umbrella. And we're going to talk about that. So the discourse.
Like we do theft, accidental theft versus intentional.
Exactly.
Well, can I add something?
Sure.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shirley Chu, and I teach the BUS. I mainly teach the BUS 500, which is the first course in leadership in the MBA program. And what I've noticed over the course of 2.5 years is a lot of the students from like Nepal, India, some of them from China, but they've never worked with APA before. And so it's not, I think, illegal or reckless. It's not illegal if they don't know it in the beginning. But if you provide them with all the resources and they still don't do well on the first paper, and you point out exactly what they do wrong and you give them the resources, then I think it becomes intentional, and that it is theft. I think it is theft once you point it out. But they really look at me saying, like, we've never had this format before. It's like learning a new language. So I do think it's like a gradual transition to theft after you've told them 4 or 5 times. That's how I see it. Thank you.
I'd like to interject. It's not necessarily an APA component. Plagiarism, all the different styles have a discourse and a discussion about plagiarism. It spans all the different styles from any type of writing. So APA is more about how you cite it and reference it, but it does not have a lock on if something's plagiarism or not.
Exactly, and that's
I'd like
a
to add
point well taken.
something, and I agree with Dr. Cho, because first, as a professor, we have to give them something in terms of ask from them something. If we do not teach them how to do properly, we cannot ask how it should do. For example, your today's webinar calls plagiarism related international students. So we teach a lot of international students who does not have any in the past experience with the plagiarism. So
Correct.
Therefore, they cannot equal that action to the crime before
Culturally,
explain.
it's weird, but culturally, I mean, being Asian myself, culturally, in those countries, it's flattering to copy. So it's almost opposite in terms of the culture. It's flattering. It's considered flattery to directly copy, which is got to get that out of their head.
I got to say that, well, beforehand, that when if you ask them, could you do this in universities in your country? I have never had a student say yes. So, the cultural aspect is significant, but it's not like they do it in universities in those countries.
Exactly. And these are all excellent points, and they're all going to be recycled again throughout the presentation. Jim, your point is well taken, but at the same time, Dr. Shirley is also well taken. I don't think that she's saying that it's specifically APA, but I think she's alluding to the fact that it's the academic system or the academic referencing system, whether it's APA, MLA, Vancouver, Harvard, that they're not used to such a formalized system of referencing. And this is something that we're going to come back to. So it's an academic issue. That's like, as Jim said, it's not contained to just one referencing style, but it's actually the academic skill of referencing. And we're going to come to all of this. We're going to come back to all of this. So just let's look at some of the statements on the prevalence of plagiarism in higher education. Unfortunately, it's always been a part of university study. I mean, dissertations, projects. Students cheat. That's just the reality. Students cheat. They plagiarize, they copy. With the advent of the internet, plagiarism has metastasized. Now, anyone familiar with the terrible disease of cancer, cancer starts at one place, but then, all of a sudden it just goes out of control, and that's usually what leads to, the person unfortunately dying. The same thing with the internet and plagiarism. So with the advent of the internet, the tools and the amount of access to different ways of plagiarism that students have has just gone out of control. In a report in the Independent newspaper from the UK, they reported on throughout a 3-year span, they caught about 50,000 students cheating, and they label it as basically a plagiarism epidemic. So this is not something that is new. This is not something that's going away anytime soon. And it's something that's very important. It affects, what we do in our classrooms. And it has, it has lots of relevance to what we do on an everyday basis. Another agency, the QAA in the UK, they actually issued a formal complaint to limit or to ban the advertisement of essay mills on websites, because these essay mill companies will advertise with no shame whatsoever. Yeah, we'll do your essay for you, we'll do your project for you, And this agency said this is completely against ethical standards. We need to get rid of this. So they lodged a formal complaint, about 30 pages. You can find it. I have it in the reference section if you'd like to look at follow up for more information. So it is definitely a problem in higher education. I would like to know from all of you who have taught these students, have you had any personal experiences with plagiarism? Have you seen any rises in plagiarism over the years? How frequent, what's the volume of plagiarism that you see? I would like to hear just a little bit about that. I don't think you're not on mute, Mr. David.
I probably catch more than just about anyone, and yeah, and plagiarism is definitely on the rise. And every class, since I've started, for instance, just at Westcliff, I've been teaching for a few years, but at Westcliff, usually the first couple of weeks, especially, it's interesting, like the discussion questions, because they know that Turnitin is going to catch it. So I look at something on a discussion question and I'm like, and I tell them the first day of class, you think I'm not going to catch it? I'm going to catch it. Yeah. And I said, you'll get a 0 for it. And that's the one thing I said, to me, that's like you're lying to me, and I don't give someone a second chance to lie to me. And this last class, just this term, I would say, I've probably caught about 10 so far in one class, and probably 6 or so are the other classes.
Wow.
I catch an inordinate amount.
Anyone like to add?
I think the difference with Professor Johnson is that he is actively looking for it.
Okay,
because he knows it's prevalent, whereas many others do not look for it and therefore cannot see it or cannot notice it when they see it. I've also experienced a lot. I have less plagiarism at Westcliff. I have the opposite, and more at other universities. And again, even though they know, they still do it because they don't think you're going to check everyone.
I wouldn't say I look for it. That's an unfair characterization. But
I didn't mean it negatively. I meant it as a positive.
It's not like that's my predation for that. But no, it's not. I read it and I go, this doesn't sound like a student. So I copy, paste it, throw it through a plagiarism checker, and I'm usually 90% correct. So,
excellent. Anyone else have experiences seem to be on two opposite ends?
I mean, I agree with both the professors. It's just a matter of education. They know better, but they don't know the exact, probably the exact particular ways. And if you, like you said, if they know better, but they don't want to put the time and effort in. And if we emphasize it at Westcliff and we give them, Dr. Johnson has great resources. He has a video, a slide. I mean, I have a sample paper. If you do all of that and you keep telling them that that's your expectations and the grade you get is the grade you earn, I think it's just like plagiarism is on the rise if you don't, if you let it get out of control. But it's manageable if you educate them and you tell them what your expectations are in the beginning, and you give them a bad grade if they plagiarize in the first couple of weeks. I found that to work. And you meet with them and tell them that this is not acceptable. You have to take a really hardline approach. You can't be nice about it.
Excellent. Okay, excellent. We're going to come back.
Professor Jenkins, I just want to add something. I agree with all of the professors. However, you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that plagiarism almost maybe equal to the crime. It's criminal, right?
The discourse, the discourse of those policy statements indicated that, yes.
Okay, most of the people, it's agreed, stealing, it's theft, etc. However, if university did not provide any education sources in terms of plagiarism, in terms of how to write properly, how to get, we cannot tell them you did this because we did not give in the beginning, before we start normal education, normal classes, we should provide them classes 1 day, half a day, 2 hours, 3 hours about the plagiarism. And then we can ask them what they have to do in proper way.
Excellent.
And by the way, one other caveat is that I have a number of students that email me afterwards. I'd say about half of them that say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. You know, I'm sorry I got caught." I mean, it's interesting that especially that they know that they're not supposed to, which, by the way, is also evident by the fact that they don't do it nearly as much on the assignments as they do the discussion questions. So, you know, there's an element that they do know it. And really, when you talk to them, they're not going to. I go back to, would you do this in your own? If you got caught in your own country, or even here, a number of them go to undergraduate school here, and they think it's okay because we're not going to get caught. So there's a large element of that we're choosing to ignore and almost look for excuses for them on. I do, Dr. Sherman's very right as far as that we still have to educate them on how. A lot of it is, I mean, you're going to go through the presentation. There is a lot of accidental in the sense that they think that, hey, I put the author's name on it. That should be good enough. Dr. Sherman was absolutely correct on that element of it.
Right. I mean, I think what Dr. Sherman is alluding to is that we sort of assume that students, when they come to join us at university, regardless of where they've come from, but particularly if they've come as international students, coming from their own context, we assume that they already have an idea about what plagiarism is, that plagiarism is a universally accepted concept, universally accepted in academia all over the world. And this is something that we're going to examine later on in this presentation about the universality of plagiarism and what kind of context our students are coming from, even in the States itself, but also outside of the States. So we'll come back to all of these great comments. So we've established so far that based on the discourse, plagiarism is bad. There are severe penalties and plagiarism is prevalent. So why do students continue to do it? If they know it's bad, if they know that there are penalties, then why do they continue to do it? At this stage, Professor Eve, I'd like to have a breakout session where essentially we will get into groups and each group will discuss what they believe the primary reasons why students plagiarize is, and then we will come back and discuss it together.
Okay, lovely. I'm going to start dividing the groups and I'm going to leave 4 people in this main room, okay, for recording purposes.
Okay.
Do you need volunteers to be in the main room or you're just assigning?
No, I will assign them.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
And I'll just observe too. I won't butt in. So go ahead and discuss, and I'll just take notes.
Okay. Sorry, it takes a bit because we're 30 people, but I'm almost ready.
Yep. It'll take about 3 to 5 minutes. Nothing too long.
Okay.
Professor Jenkins, can you meanwhile repeat what we should do in the private rooms? I missed that part.
So discuss what you think are the primary reasons, the main reasons why students plagiarize. Why do they plagiarize? They know it's bad. They know there are penalties involved, consequences. So why do they do it? What's the
in
reason?
the group, right?
Yeah, in the group. Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I will open all the rooms right now. Okay. So there will be at least 3 people remaining in the main room.
Okay.
For the conversation. Yeah. That's right. Okay, and then we have Professor Hoon, Shirley Chuo, Sherma Mott, Shelley Corwin. They can then have their conversation here.
Okay.
Hello, doctors.
How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
Fantastic. Still trying to wake up this early morning, but.
All right. Dr.
Okay,
Sayed is here
so,
too.
yeah, so I think that the reason why students do it is because it's faster. I mean, it saves time to copy and paste, and they don't want to spend the time to do, because I mean, if you plagiarize, you're looking at you're looking at 25% of the time that you would take to actually sit down and think about what you're going to write, and actually, you know, so instead of spending 4 hours on a paper, you would spend an hour. That's how I think students see it, and they feel that the risk of getting caught is worth the, you know, they weigh the risk of getting caught versus not getting caught versus how much time it would take.
Do you, I think that is definitely an option. Do you also think that confidence has anything to do with it? Like maybe not feeling confident enough about what they could produce on their own, so they think it would just
it's a cultural shift. It really is. I mean, especially in my beginning courses, like I said, a lot of my students are the first course or the first 3 courses that they take. So they're very unconfident about how to write this paper in, you know, APA or.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so, but I find even when I give them a sample paper and they plagiarize, I'm talking about those students, the ones that are not confident and they're sincerely want to learn, when I give them the sample paper, they actually do it. But there were 4 of my students that even with the sample paper in there, they didn't read it and they just plagiarized. And they were very surprised that they got like a C-. They were so surprised.
I have some different idea about this. If you pay attention, Professor Jenkins mentioned about that plagiarism recognized as a universality. It's in the universe everywhere, the same norms, the same requirements. However, if you go to mathematics, 2 times 2, yes, everyone knows around the world 2 times 2 equals to 4. However, I have background of education myself, 2 masters from foreign countries, where I did not have any idea about plagiarism, any idea about APA formatting. I did not have base skills how to write proper way as required in the United States, as an example in this case. So I came here, I learned here myself from the zero, from the scratch, how to write proper way. I did understand plagiarism or copying, pasting is the stealing. I did not know either.
No,
so
I mean, yeah, students don't know. Students don't know.
So
it's our responsibility to teach them.
Back to universality of the plagiarism norms. It should be as a math, 2 times 2, 4 everywhere. Not in China 5, in Russia 10, in America 4, not. Everywhere should be the same, and plagiarism should be the same way.
Well, I agree, Dr. Sherm, is that I find that there are some professors that are spending an hour or 2 in the first 2 weeks of class to go over plagiarism and turn it in and show them learn and show them resources and show them how to cite. But I find that it's not universal. Some professors are not doing it. So why do students do it? Some students do it because they have no idea. They have no idea what the format is, just as yourself. And some students, like my students, do it after I've spent so many hours. I have at least 7 resources on GAP. You know, I've gone through every single one of them. And the 4 that do it, you know, they're lazy or they just don't want to spend time, and they were surprised that they got caught. So that's the flip side.
As an example, yeah. As an example, I got my degree in America, my doctoral degree. And when I start working, I noticed, I've been told similarity is not good. So as you were my professor, you know me.
Yeah.
So as soon I saw my similarity shows 10%, 15%, I was crazy, and I was looking, nothing bad, nothing somewhere. And what I did, I create something new. Do you know that reference list, it can be 100% in everywhere similarity because everyone used that references. So what I did is I made reference list PDF format, put to my Word, and I submitted, turn it in, where reference list showing 0 similarity. So this is how I try to avoid similarity, therefore plagiarism. So,
Right.
so therefore students, they don't know what to do, how to do. Maybe they have no idea how to correct themselves.
I definitely agree that the standard of instruction at Westcliff in terms of different professors is different in terms of this plagiarism. Some of them go through it really, really vigorously, and some of them just leave it up to the student, and some of them don't realize where the student is coming from. And it's just, it should be more, there should be more standards and there should be more materials. Some of my students did look at the stuff on the Writing Center and they watched the video on formatting and plagiarism, you know, but they went out of their way to do it. It should be a required something, you know, it should be required universal standard format.
That's a very good point. And we're gonna,
even though we have the resources available to our students and we're, you know, trying to teach them to do things properly, there's still going to be that percentage of students that are still plagiarizing, even though they have the materials. And I think that that's just, it's a problem. And I completely agree with what you're saying as far as the time management piece. I think that a lot of people are crunched for time and they just find it easier. And I think that that's a really important point too.
Yeah, now that we're all back in the main room, so we've listened to some of the conversations that we've had from the main room. What other sorts of reasons do we attribute to why students plagiarize? I'd like to hear from everybody else.
Yeah, hi. I was part of Group 4, Kevin Sheridan, and we came up with in addition to saving time, we had 3 others. One, that it was a bad academic habit that students are used to, so they continue to do it. The convenience of plagiarizing, and also their motivation level. Are they there just to check a box and get through a course, or are they actually motivated to engage in academic rigor and the critical thinking process? So those were the 4 that we had, Group 4.
Excellent, excellent. Any other contributions?
Hi, it's Dr. Goodstone. I'll just jump in because we came up with many of the same types of things in Group 2, and I want to thank Diana Sigeroff and other members of our group. But the percentages of being caught is like playing the odds. And they know that they're not going to get caught every time. And as many times as they can get away with it, that's part of the reinforcement to do it. You don't always get caught. And so that was part of the concern. Also, that in not managing your time well, which is another aspect of student life and how important it is to manage your preparation and research for assignments and so on, there's that pressure to get the assignment done quickly, to use material that may not be your own, but it fills the assignment and you don't necessarily cite it if you feel like you don't have to. And another aspect of this is that in the DQ, we don't have a formal checking process for plagiarism. So they know that's a fertile field to try to play those odds. In addition, the question came up with, I'm a professor and I'm seeing in the discussion what I think looks like a plagiarism response. What do I do since I'm not in checking it, you know, or it's not part of the checking for the school? Well, part of it is you can take the time and look at that resource and see what's in there. And many times I find that that's copied word for word. Half the paragraph or whole paragraphs are taken. So I have the strength then to really point to that. But if not, I know when it's not the student's voice, and we're having a meeting about that and what to do next because it needs to be improved upon. And then finally, the idea of no repository. So if I am into this whole plagiarism correction in one class and let's say penalty or identification, in the next class, my slate is clean. And that really needs to be corrected. There needs to be a record that follows with the student. And that's what, and if anyone else has other things from 2, please, join in, but that's my notes.
Excellent. Excellent.
Dr. Jenkins, I'm with group number 1.
Yeah.
And we came up with a lot of those. To add on to that, we also talked a little bit with the rolling of the dice. There's also just maybe a lack of consistency from instructor to instructor, or course to course, or even level to level. So undergrad, maybe they got away with things a little bit more, and then in the grad level, the expectation is much higher anyway. And so they're more vigilant to that. And so sometimes they kind of play the odds, like she had said. So that's one of them. Another one that we came up with was there's an insecurity of the content. And sometimes they don't feel comfortable. Maybe the concepts are very, very big, and the terminology, and they don't feel comfortable putting it in their own words. And so there's a little bit of apprehension to that. So they're not as likely to put it in their own words. And sometimes that if we help instill that and empower them, that might allow them to feel comfortable to express themselves in an academic manner, to kind of address those concepts. But that's kind of what we came up with.
Excellent. Excellent. Anyone have anything different to all of the discussions we've had so far?
I just want to mention, because we didn't get into it, maybe we will going forward, and I don't want to start giving the definition of it because it's a tricky subject, but there's self-plagiarism, and how does self-plagiarism work, and how do we apply that to all that we receive in papers and discussions and so on.
Absolutely.
Representation of your own work, when it works, when it's not appropriate.
Absolutely. All of these things, excellent. We'll get into in much greater detail. What we're going to examine now, though, is we're going to examine some of the reasons. And if we move on, just 1 second here. If we move on, so why do students plagiarize? Okay, before we analyze the reasons, the myriad of reasons why they plagiarize, for me, it's important that we start laying a particular groundwork and a framework for how we need to conceptualize plagiarism when we're dealing with international students and we're dealing with local students. There are a myriad of reasons why students plagiarize, but fundamental to understanding this is that there is something called intentional plagiarism and there's unintentional plagiarism, and they're not one and the same. And we cannot treat each as if it's all just under the one umbrella of criminality. The other thing is that we do have, you probably have more international students, but you do have also local students. And so the reasons why a local student or a national student from the US would plagiarize would be a bit different than, in some cases, it might be a bit different than what the reasons would be for an international student. Could someone just throw out an example of how that dynamic might work differently for someone because some of us said, okay, maybe they might not feel confident, maybe from a language standpoint, but if somebody already knows fluent English, what would be the reasons why someone from the US, let's say a US student, would plagiarize?
It doesn't matter you do speak fluent English or you don't speak English. Plagiarism is completely different things. Plagiarism is your knowledge. Do you know that subject? Do you know that answer? It no matter what language you speak on.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, the American students use the, your course heroes and, UKSAs and so forth just as much as international students. That's a misnomer to say it's just international students.
Right,
By a long shot.
Agree.
Exactly. Okay, good. So I think it's important to treat cases of plagiarism individually without making any broad generalizations, as we've mentioned about, U.S. students do this and international students do this. It's a lot of different dynamics and a lot of different factors involved, and we're going to start looking at those more closely. So I'm going to start with the intentional reasons because that is generally what people associate plagiarism with. They associate with an intention, to steal or to purposely deceive, the professor. So some of the reasons, as many of us mentioned already, too much pressure because of the workload they have. They just don't have enough time. It's easier to plagiarize than to do the work. So, just take the easy way out. I have all these things to do. Just go ahead and get it off the internet. Poor time management. which again, that's an academic skill. That's not something that has to do with language or nationality or anything like that, but that's just not managing your time well. Pressures to succeed. That is something that might affect a student. Their parents are doctors, engineers, things like that, and so they have this tremendous pressure to succeed at a high level. But if they're not prepared, then what do they do? Lack of language proficiency, which would definitely be in the case of international students. Temptation due to the internet. Maybe somebody, he or she is, they're on the cusp of really trying to, work through the material and really do it. But again, it's like, well, it's just that easy. Just go to the internet. So they, they have a sort of a weakness in integrity, or a case of weakness of integrity. Fear of failure, which is very similar to pressures to succeed. Someone mentioned laziness in the very beginning of the presentation. Again, also belief that they won't get caught. Just take the dice, roll the dice. I have been doing it for so long, so why not continue? And then also that it's not that serious. So borrowing something from somebody else or using it and passing it off is not really that big a deal. So those are some of the reasons that we came up with. Some of the unintentional reasons, okay? So a poor understanding of referencing and plagiarism. This is something that is going to be recurrent now in the next few slides. So a lack of understanding of what referencing is, what's the purpose of it. Also carelessness. So some students, just again, and this goes back to academic skills. So not knowing how, maybe in taking notes, they didn't identify which words were theirs and which words were from the author. And then, when it's time to put everything together, they sort of get mixed up. Surface conceptions of learning, working in a second language, failure to understand the role of academic tasks. So some students don't understand what it is the task that's asked of them. And so they just throw whatever they think sounds right. And again, if they don't really understand it, then they might go to other sources that are on the same topic and just go ahead and use that. Cultural background, that's in red, we're going to come right back to that. But after that, before that, prior education. So it depends, in the US, certain schools, schools are of different standards, and then certain schools, high schools, and colleges prepare students to be scholars. So they are very versed in what it is to reference and, using other secondary sources and things like that, and then other schools aren't. So some students may not, again, have the tradition of using references by the time they get to university. But this issue of culture, so cultural background, this is something that we're going to analyze in much greater detail now, because this is something I've heard, we've touched on it, but we haven't really delved into how much plagiarism really is a cultural practice. And we're going to talk about that. So what do I mean? It's a cultural practice. Plagiarism is a cultural practice. Plagiarism is not a universally accepted concept. And when I say that, I'm talking about the conventions, the whole dynamic of you have an author, you have to go to that author, you have to, use quotations. When you're talking about direct quotes, you have to use, parentheses for paraphrasing, things like that. I'm talking about the conventions of it. I'm not saying that stealing of somebody else's ideas, that is not, on a moral basis, that's not universal. I think we can all agree, to some degree that, every culture to some extent, has an idea of what's right and wrong, and nobody would accept theft as something that is acceptable. But again, when we get to the concept of intellectual property, then that's where things start to get a bit different. When we think about plagiarism, we need to understand that plagiarism is the idea of stealing intellectual property. And this idea about intellectual property is really something born out of the Enlightenment period. And it was a time where they attached great importance to agency and individual creation of intellectual property. I'm going to just very quickly, there's a snippet from a piece that I was fortunate to publish this year. which says, others have clarified that plagiarism as understood in the West is a historical and cultural phenomenon, the response to a particular set of economic, social, and technological conditions, and may not be applicable to writing cultures and rhetorical traditions marked by a different course of development. So the idea of plagiarism, stealing someone's intellectual property, is something very, very particular to the West, and it was born out of a set of particular economic, social, and technological conditions. I write further, thus plagiarism is a reality, but it should not be considered a universal reality. At a theoretical level, the principal idea of textual ownership is rooted in Anglo-Saxon Enlightenment thinking, which necessarily positions it in contention with other writing traditions that have different conceptualizations of what intellectual ownership means. So what is ownership of an idea? This is something that is, it's different from culture to culture. And we're gonna talk about how it's different. But in the West, if somebody comes up with an idea, that person, the root of it is that ideas are money. When you think about it, ideas are money. So if somebody, if I have an idea, then I have the potential to profit tremendously from this idea. If somebody just goes ahead and takes my idea, takes my property and capitalizes on it, then you have now denied me my right to profit monetarily from the idea that I've come up with. So there's a financial and monetary aspect to the creation of intellectual property that must be protected at all times. The other thing is that what I mentioned in my piece is that knowledge construction, okay? So how knowledge is formed and where it's placed is very different from culture to culture. So for instance, if we come up with ideas in the West, they're automatically private, they're privatized, right? So it's not in the public domain. Whereas in other cultures, no. If somebody comes up with an idea, it's something that is shared amongst everybody. Everybody has access to it. And there's no need to reference it because it's communal. So this is something that we need to be aware of when dealing with plagiarism. That plagiarism is not something that, as a concept of intellectual property appropriation, that is not something that is accepted everywhere. Now, that being said, if students are coming to the West and they go into studying Western, educations, higher educational bodies, then yes, they have to acclimate to what we do in the West. But at the same time, we have to account for the fact that they might be coming from different cultures that don't necessarily have the same concept of intellectual property. Another aspect, so that is the cultural aspect of plagiarism. Another aspect is that the writing in English, it may seem straightforward, but is also a cultural enterprise. It is a phenomenally complex language skill. It is the most difficult to develop, and it's usually the last one to develop for language learners. And I'm getting into the educational side of it, but it's not because I'm favoring the College of Education or College of Business. This is when you're dealing with projects and writing. This is a critical aspect of plagiarism, is the skill of writing. So there are writing is a very complex skill. It's the last one to be developed. There are actually some cultures that don't have writing systems. And with that said, writing is also not universally the same. What I mean by that is the writing system. So the understanding of how to put thoughts together is different. In the West, we have a different, we have a sort of a linear approach to writing. And in other cultures, it might be circular, it might be, other things, but it's a different way of, your cultural influence will shape the way that you see the world and how you express yourself. So we are very direct to the point. So that's how we expect our writing to be. That's how research is done. But in other cultures, it's different. And we're going to analyze that in just a little bit. So we need to understand that in addition to plagiarism itself as a concept being cultural, writing is a cultural exercise as well. And this is something that the students have to grasp, you know, in their first semester or first year of coming to the States and learning. Not only are they understanding plagiarism as a cultural phenomenon that might be different to what they understand, also writing itself, how they express themselves in this, with the skill of writing is different, right? And it takes time. What would you, do any of you have any experiences with writing? For those of you, for instance, who are bilingual, could you allude to differences in the way you write in another language as opposed to writing in English?
I am myself multilingual, and English is not even second, third, it's many languages I do speak in fluence. However, I learn English very late. It doesn't mean my English not fluent. It does not give me any excuse to do any plagiarism. Plagiarism is the knowledge. I mean, you making because of you don't have enough knowledge. You don't have enough vocabulary to write your statement. You can read it in English. However, first thing I would say, if you accepted to the English-speaking universities or institution, you already have been accepted as a knowing English language properly. Foreigners, they passing the TOEFL or ESL classes. After that, they have been accepted to the universities. So therefore, language or being foreigner cannot be excused for having any plagiarism. You read in English, close your computer, close your book, write with your word, and then after that you make your own sentence, own paragraph, and then work on your grammar afterwards if you do not have enough English skills. So that's why I said being foreigner or having English as a second or third language cannot be excused.
I think if we're looking at the writing and not necessarily taking into account plagiarism at the moment, but the difference is, one thing that I've noticed is in English, I really expect everything to be laid out for me, and I write that way as a result. But when I read texts translated, usually by Japanese authors, I sometimes find myself finding the ending a little vague for me. And so I've noticed that it has a more cyclical approach, or you need to actually, or it's making me have to read into it in a different way. And so I've noticed that. And then as a writer, writing in French, I learned to have more variety of language, whereas in English, it's very acceptable to be more repetitive, to drive home the point, whereas it's different in French. So I think, is that what you were asking about, the differences between?
Yeah, exactly, yep. Mm-hmm. Excellent, yep. Yeah,
if I may, I like to add a couple of points. While I think I have some experience in writing in different languages, about 5. So what I've noticed, and this is across the disciplines, is that the fact that even with an engineering background, I believe that if you have done enough reading, that tells you a little bit about how you can write. Sometimes I just think that some of the students who struggle with this concept of writing their own words, that they don't have enough reading skills. I mean, they don't understand the format you should read, because obviously if you read a lot of books or journal articles, after a while you get the hang of how it's supposed to be roughly, right? So I think in some ways when you tie it down to plagiarism, it comes down to the fact that they're not disciplined enough to do the reading and then follow up with the writing. And it's more, the way I see it, yeah, it's certain skills, auditory and all that you need to have. But I think sometimes it's just a lack of effort, not necessarily that you can't do it, but, right. During that time frame, a lack of effort.
Right, excellent, well said. Professor Johnson?
It's interesting because I just read a paper on a dissertation on bribery and the various components of it, how the cultural elements of it. But it's interesting that because similarly, it's not officially acceptable. How it's done is one thing. you know, how this is how business is done in this country, but it's still not officially acceptable. And I do want to go back to the fact that at the universities that everybody is coming from, it is not acceptable there either.
Right.
I don't know any university in the world that this is acceptable. So we have a cultural component to it, but you know, let's be careful that we're not giving it an excuse.
Right, absolutely, and good. And I'm glad you mentioned that. That we're not. This is not an attempt to excuse students, but it's rather an attempt to explain why some students will some students will plagiarize, not accounting for the intentional or the devious aspect of it. So this is mostly concerned with unintentional cases of plagiarism. We have to move on a little bit because we're running a little bit out of time. So good. Just one second. Yeah, so the logic of writing English is different. In a piece by Robert Kaplan, he said, logic, which is the base of rhetoric, is evolved out of culture. It is not universal. So the way we formalize logic in English in the West is different than how it's done in different cultures. And Professor Jennifer mentioned about how things are done in French and Japanese. It varies from culture to culture. Thought patterns. There is not a better or worse system than any other, but they're just different. So many of our students come to the university with different writing traditions, which is something that we have to account for when we're trying to bring them on board to what we do in the West. And one of the ways of doing that, and this is something that has come up repeatedly in this workshop, is that he proposed that we must take these cultural differences, we must make these cultural differences overtly apparent to the students. So there needs to be some sort of induction period, right? Some sort of training period, preferably at the beginning of a semester or the beginning of a student's academic career, where everything is laid out for the student in terms of, this is what we expect, this is how it might be different from what you're used to for writing traditions in your culture, but this is what we expect. This is how English writing these are the expectations, and this has proven with research, this has proven to mitigate the instances of plagiarism caused by students. If we look very quickly at this this graph. Now, this is not supposed to be one monolithic explanation of the entire English language and Chinese language. I mean, there's variations within each language, but just as a general analysis of the differences, in general, the English language is linear in approach. You have point A, and then point A leads to point B, and so on and so forth. And the onus of responsibility is on the writer. So the writer has to make it very clear what he or she is saying, and there's no room for ambiguity, right? And everything has to be a logical flow, as Jennifer mentioned, right? That everything is their expectations, and there's a certain flow to the text that I'm expecting. It's methodical, it's predictable, it might be a bit boring, but that's just the way it is, and it stems from our cultural value on being direct and to the point, right? So students who write text and they say in 20 words what they can say in 5, we generally would deduct points, right? Because you're going around the issue, you're not going to the issue. So there's a cultural value of directness in English, whereas in other cultures it's different, right? In Chinese language, based on the research, anything can be related if it has a loose connection to the topic. The onus is on the responsibility is on the reader to sort of figure out what the main idea is from the author. As the author doesn't have to really make anything clear. It's fine to be predictable. And Xing et al., they said that for a Chinese student writing in a Chinese rhetorical mode, but in English, right? So their rhetorical thought patterns, if they're writing in the rhetorical thought patterns of Chinese, but they're writing in English, is going to appear irrelevant, illogical, and unclear to someone from, an English speaker, because we just don't arrange our thoughts in the same way. So students, not only do they have to understand the academic skills of referencing and using secondary sources, they have to understand how do you think in English and write in English, not think in Chinese and write in English. And again, some of the going around the issue and not really getting to the point, it comes from a cultural value of saving face in Chinese culture. So the way students, the thought patterns that they use in writing is something that it's very deeply ingrained, and it's not something that can just be, sort of wiped away in one semester, right? So students need time to develop their English voice. Again, that's on them. That you don't have time. At the university level, you don't have time to get them to develop that. But that is something that comes into the equation when students don't really understand how it is. What are the expectations of U.S. university professors? Also, there's an issue of imitation. So in Chinese culture, imitation is considered the highest form of flattery. So the more you imitate a writer, then that means that you are giving him or her respect and venerating them and things like that. Now again, that might be what is done in Chinese context, but again, that has to be shifted and adjusted to U.S. context, and it has to be understood that we cannot imitate someone, regardless of how much we want to venerate them, without giving them proper attribution. So teaching writing is as much a cultural practice as it is a language skill exercise. It's very important to get students to understand this. Again, if there was some induction program that can lay out the linguistic aspects of writing projects for business or writing projects for education, if it lays out the academic aspects of it and it lays out the cultural aspects, then I think that we would be doing the students a great service. We have to account for the cognitive and cultural influences on your students' writing, the thought pattern organization. And it helps, but not necessary, obviously, to understand how writing operates in your students' tradition. So, for instance, I'm here in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and I've learned that in writing for Arabic students, they don't even write that much in Arabic. So essentially, and not even they don't write academically in Arabic. So essentially, when they come to me at university level, they're writing English. So they're writing for the first time, the skill of writing academically for the first time when they come to me, and they're doing it in a different language. So that's a tremendous amount of challenges and obstacles for the students when they are doing their projects. So again, you have to merge between maintaining standards of academic integrity, maintaining standards, ethical standards, and at the same time accounting for where the students are coming from. So the challenges, as we mentioned, are academic, they're cultural, and they're linguistic. So generally, the way the dynamic of plagiarism works is that there's some sort of assignment laid out. So write an assignment or some project or report, and then you have the student who comes in, and the student will have a certain level of language proficiency, a certain awareness of APA format, MLA format, referencing formats, local versus international. That might, the motivations for plagiarism might be, different based on local versus international. Subject competency, so how much do they actually know about the subject is going to determine how much, what propensity they have to plagiarize. And then also their personal integrity at the end of the day. And I put that last because I really shy away from blanket saying that any case of plagiarism is a lack of personal integrity. Yes, that's definitely an element of it. But, for each case, you have to really analyze and see try to get to the bottom of it to see what is the real reason or what the combination of reasons is. And then there's also pressure factors. So based on competitiveness within a particular class or in a family or things like that. Also deadlines, things that we mentioned before, competency, and then the cultural influence. This cultural influence, like Professor Johnson mentioned, you know, in some cultures, there's this expectancy that you're going to share, right? And how in depth you share and whether you share or not, you know, that ranges from culture to culture. But in some cultures, it's sort of expected that, okay, you have learned the information over. Now, how are you going to share with us? And that's something that we need to be aware of. That there are cultural influences on the reasons why students plagiarism. Again, this is not making an excuse for students at all. We're just analyzing what are the reasons why students plagiarize. So the types of plagiarism committed. So a student might plagiarize using one of the, actually, I guess I can ask you guys. We have a little bit of time, but what sorts of ways have you found or you discovered plagiarism by your students?
Plagiarism websites like Course Hero by far is the most prevalent. I mean, they're websites specifically for that, and so all the other arguments you mentioned pretty much go out the window on that.
Yep.
Adding to that, I'd say by right-clicking a lot of phrases, whether in papers that Turnitin might catch or might not, and discussion questions especially, that's how you find a lot of suspicious material.
Yep. Excellent. Anything else? Okay, yes. So things that students do, they simply copy an assignment from the internet, just like Professor Johnson mentioned. They might use, and this is what Professor Goodstone had alluded to, they might use an old assignment of an old friend for the same class, or they might plagiarize for themselves. So they might use the same assignment that they have for one class and they just go ahead and erase the course title and put the same assignment for another class. They might also forget to use proper citation techniques. Now, again, some students might honestly forget, and then some might feign to forget, but lack of proper citation techniques can be one of the type of plagiarism committed. And then also there are businesses, you know, online shops, physical shops in the UK and the US where you just go ahead and pay them the money and they, you know, pump out a dissertation for you, no problem. And then also one that's not as easily to detect is if they hire somebody to write their assignment. So you run it through Turnitin, you run it through Save Assign, nothing is caught. But you know for sure that this student did not write this paper, right? So those are that's a difficult method to identify, but there are ways to get around it. And then also translation. Some students just literally put the whole thing in the original language and then just press translate, and that comes out, and then that's what they submit to the teacher. Okay, so you think you know how your students plagiarize. Okay, what are some ways that you can detect plagiarism? So we talked about the types of plagiarism that they do. So these are the ways that they plagiarize. But how do you find out? How do you detect how students plagiarize? Some of them are pretty obvious, salient, and then some of them are subtle. So what are the ways that you can detect? What are some pretty obvious ways that you can detect if a student is plagiarizing? And what are some subtle ways?
First of all, you know your student while you're in the class, you're talking, you know your student's vocabulary, you know your student's speech, you know your student's how he or she makes the sentences, and you can obviously see on the written way, it can be not slightly different, it can be completely different language in a written way. That is the one. The second is, do you mean beside the Turnitin?
Yeah, besides Turnitin.
If you're not sure about yourself, you just copy, paste on the Google search, and that comes up to you.
Okay. Other ways that are pretty obvious or subtle, other ways that are subtle that you can detect that something is off?
I've seen cases where a student would essentially use a past question by somebody on an open forum as a reference. So it's like, it's dated like in 2014. It's basically telling me, here, I took it from here. And like, okay, well, shouldn't do that. But so basically done no work at all.
I had an assignment submitted, instead of my name, different professor's name, the same student, the same class. And I asked a student in private, he said, "Oh, professor, I'm sorry, I didn't pass last time this class. So this is the second time, this is my work." So I said, "You should be able at least change my name."
Yes. Yes.
A lot of it has to do with knowing what's out there, knowing, you know, you teach a class enough times, you get used to a lot of the materials. Once, you know, and then being able to take it back in. I've seen some extreme forms where, and this was actually a fellow instructor at a different college, had someone, and it was one of these course hero type things, a paper he had written for his degree had been uploaded by someone else. It was actually one of his professors had uploaded it. And then someone just took the whole thing, copied it, and pasted it in for an assignment. So a student turned in a paper that the professor actually wrote to him, didn't even realize that the name was the same. And then, you know, no, I didn't plagiarize.
Right, of course.
So, I mean, there's all sorts of, they don't even look. I've had students turn in papers from course heroes that had been submitted to me by another student 2 years before.
Actually, recently I noticed completely different new thing on Turnitin. For example, student A submit the work on time on Tuesday, and students saw the similarity about 20%. And then after 1 day, student noticed that 20% turned to 50%. And when I'm checking the student submission, I do see similarity on both of them. So if student A submit original work, student B copy paste from student A, so Turnitin shows to both of them similarity high. I think student A shouldn't be this way.
Right. Okay, good, good. So there are a number of different detection methods, ways that plagiarism comes out. We know the students, it's not their work. Some of it includes drastic fluctuations in style and language at the text level. All of a sudden, the student becomes Shakespeare in a matter of 2 paragraphs, right? They have a certain level, and then all of a sudden they are, you know, writing just tremendous, tremendously advanced work. No in-text citations. So you have a swath of the report that's just, you know, no type of referencing at all, but again, very high level. Then glaring formatting issues, right? So sometimes the font is different, the margins are crazy, right? The font size varies from paragraph to paragraph. So this is just a simple copy and paste. So those are pretty obvious ways to detect whether students are plagiarized or not. Some different ways that are subtle is that, again, you have students, as Dr. Sherman mentioned, you talk with the student, you know the student at a certain level, but what they're producing is very high, at a very high level, but it's not being caught by Turnitin. So you're like, wait a minute, time out. You know, like, I mean, what's going on here? Now, to be fair, there are some students who their oral competency is not as high as their written competency, and that's something that you can, you know, you have to account for as well. But in general, I mean, you know, generally, you know, a student, you can tell from the language that they use in class whether or not their writing skills is, you know, should be at the same level or not. So that is something that's a bit subtle, especially when it's not detected by Turnitin. And then also, as Professor Amir mentioned, the student turns in an assignment, but the assignment doesn't really match what, you know, what the requirements are of this particular assignment, or, you know, you're addressing an issue or a topic that we covered, you know, 2 years ago. That's not the exact topic of this project. So those are ways that are sort of subtle, but you realize that the student, there might be something at hand in terms of plagiarism. Yes.
I just wanted to add one thing too. I think one that is fairly subtle yet direct is just talking to them. I had a DQ the other day, and I said, "Hey, that was a really good response. Where did you get some of that information?"
Exactly.
And then you're able to kind of assess, do they really understand the concepts? And it's very telling. And then now you have the facial and the appearance, and the uncomfortable body language and things like that. So that's a really good way to do it sometimes, especially if you have a class where you can see that. I understand sometimes the modes for learning aren't always susceptible to that, but if you have the ability, just ask them and open-ended questions, and then see how they answer. Sometimes that can tip you off sometimes too.
That's an excellent point, because that's exactly what we're going to touch on with the strategies that we can use to detect plagiarism. Yes?
Actually, sometimes in my class, I ask students to do some small writings in the class exercise. So they writing in the class, I want to see how they do citation and references. It's very small, and I do know that Dr. Johnson that this kind of things in his class as well.
Yes, that's exactly. Providing a baseline sample is very important. That's one strategy that you can use. So you have a writing task that you do in the very, very beginning of the semester, real time, in class, no access to any preparation, and then you sort of match the level of that with the level of what they produce throughout the semester, and you can really see, okay, wait a minute, this is what you're doing in class. I know you had a lot of time outside of class, but how did you get from this to this? Yeah, so there's some strategies you can use to detect plagiarism. You can use your naked eye and just, again, see the formatted issues, the language is just crazy. But then also, as Professor Brian mentioned, conferences with the student. And again, you have to be sensitive, because you don't want to put the student on the spot. But again, you can say, like, okay, well, really, you mentioned so and such in your project. Can you explain that a little bit? And if they start going then it's clear that, okay, well. But sometimes even something as basic as certain vocabulary. So I'm like, wow, that's a really nice low frequency vocabulary word you just used there. I don't even know what that means. I had to look it up. Could you tell me, what does that mean? And then if they can't tell you, then it's not, it's not their work. But again, you have to be sensitive, because you don't want to put the student on the spot and, make things unnecessarily uncomfortable. But at the same time, you have a job to be diligent, in detecting plagiarism that occurs in the students, because you don't want to give an unfair opportunity or advantage to one student, amongst others. Sometimes coincidence, sometimes it just so happens, as one of the professors, I forget who mentioned it, you just end up turning in the same paper to a professor that he himself wrote, or turn in the same assignment that some other student in the class wrote, and then the professor will see and say, okay, well, I mean, that obviously is not, there's something fishy here. So sometimes coincidence plays a factor. And then also baseline samples, as we just mentioned. So baseline samples don't correspond, right? So what you wrote for me in class, without any preparation is very different than what you have produced, here. So that's one way to do it. And then obviously digitally, you have Turnitin, you have Safe Assign, and we have about 12 minutes. So I'm going to look quickly at a sample of plagiarism, okay, and then we'll be pretty much close to wrapping up. So the main thing is that we have to be diligent. We have to be diligent in trying to identify, these instances of plagiarism, so that we don't give, students an unfair advantage over others. But at the same time, again, I think that, while we have to be diligent, we also have to be understanding, and we have to understand where the students are coming from, and really not treat every single case of plagiarism as one of criminality. But if we look here quickly, I'll just read a few. This is actually one of my students here at the university. I work at a petroleum university, and they're doing a report on a particular major that they have. So this one is talking about learning management system and how to reduce their carbon footprint. So he says, the specific purpose of my report is to investigate possible solutions for reducing papers in the university. okay, and replace it with electronic devices using learnage management system. Okay, so now I have some grammar issues. We go down to the next sentence, the following sentence. So carbon emission is a large issue that universities suffering from. Okay, so again, some grammar issues. And one of the main factors of carbon emission is paper, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. I mean, it's not Shakespeare, but it's not bad, right? And it's something that's believable for a student's level. So this was the introduction to the report. Then the student had to write a summary of one of the sources that he used to generate this report. And this is what he said. This lean, focused text concentrates on giving students a clear understanding of database fundamentals while providing a broad survey of all the major topics of the field. The result is a text that is easily covered in one semester and that only includes topics relevant to the database course. Wow, that's really nice. Like, I mean, really? How did you get from that to that? And then, you know, because it's SafeAssign, it already has it marked here that you've completely lifted that from somewhere else. So all I do is just click on this, right? So I click on this and then it shows me exactly where it came from. So from this website. This lean focused text concentrates on giving students a clear understanding of database fundamentals, blah, 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 right? So it's pretty clear when the student is plagiarized. And one of the benefits of having these plagiarism programs is that it really helps take a lot of the work off your shoulder for having to go and check and really, you know, do some investigative, it's an investigation into what, you know, what they're doing when you really can tell that the level of writing is not, you know, is not commensurate with what they've displayed in class. Just very quickly. So Westcliff University, they have a plagiarism policy. Professor Jen and Professor Eve, maybe you can correct me, I don't know. Do you guys have an induction sort of period or workshop for students when it comes to plagiarism, or is it just, you know, they're expected to understand plagiarism and that's
Yes.
sort of it?
During new student orientation, there is a plagiarism component, and then in the first 2 weeks of the of new students coming in, there are 2 scheduled APA trainings done by the Writing Center. However, those are not mandatory. They're highly recommended, and then there are follow-up videos and supports by the Writing Center.
Excellent. So here, with these actually lifted from the handbook, so it said plagiarism is the deliberate copying of written work of any length that has been published, blah, 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 blah. So there isn't this element of criminality. The wording is very, you know, it's very judicial. So it's mentioning, you know, the deliberateness of plagiarism. Here it says deliberate plagiarism again is unethical and can have serious consequences for a student's future. If the student is determined by the dean, then there's a list of, you know, disciplinary actions that are taken. If you're not familiar with this policy, I highly recommend that you read the university plagiarism policy, which you can find in the handbook. But again, it lists out very clearly, you know, what the list is or what the procedure is for identifying student plagiarism and then bringing it to the, you know, proper administrative authorities to deal with the student. It says faculty will allow the student to redo the assignment, however, will allocate a grade. So there is some aspect of a sort of a didactic approach, which I think is the best approach, that you don't necessarily just penalize the student right away and say, boom, you have a 0, but you do give the student, you know, a chance to rectify himself or herself. Again, we don't have time to go into this. We have about 3 minutes before we have to close off. So when it comes to discipline, I would say that the approach should be, because students come from, especially international students, they come from different writing traditions. Plagiarism is not something that's universally accepted. And it's something that there's a certain aspect of teaching that really needs to go into preparing the students for academia. So in its essence, it should be didactic and not necessarily punitive right away. As Dr. Cho mentioned, you know, if you've given them a series of workshops and a series of inductions, and then still with that, then they plagiarize, and it's clear that they have some, you know, they have some integrity issues. But in the beginning, I would take an a didactic approach and not be necessarily punitive. Because we have to account for cultural roles, academic skills, and language proficiency. So I wrote in my text that I just published, I said plagiarism policies in EFL context, which is English as a foreign language context, but it also can apply to international, ESL context in the States, need to consider the role of academic writing tradition in the first language and develop an induction intervention plan whose primary purpose is education of learners or educating learners about the expectations of Western scholarship. So this is very important, that students understand what the expectations are in Western scholarship, and then they're trained in it, and then they're held accountable for it, rather than just hold them accountable for it, and they may not necessarily, they might have different understandings about that. And again, it would be best if those preventative measures were in the very beginning of a student's academic career or at the very beginning of a course. And at the very end, at the end of the day, we're all employees of Westcliff University, so we have to adhere to the university's policy. But at the end of the day, we're flexible. We're allowed to be flexible, and with those who deserve flexibility. But at the same time, again, we don't want to give students unfair advantages over others, and we don't want to penalize students, harshly when they're still in the formative stages of really understanding what Western scholarship, what's involved in Western scholarship. So thank you. That is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to raise at this time, feel free.
I have a couple seconds to say about being flexible. I think if we're gonna be flexible or easygoing with some students who deserve it, we're gonna hurt them in the future. If we want them to be professional in the future, we should be hard on them, so they're gonna be thanks to us in later. Thanks.
Yeah, what I meant by be flexible is not be soft on them, but what I mean is you aren't punitive. For instance, for someone who doesn't understand what what is required of them or what is expected of them, that you prepare for instance, so for senior students or more, students who have been in the university for a few years, you should not be as flexible with them as you would with a first year student or with a first semester student, right? So you take into account, the level of the student, you take into account, where they're coming from, and then, where there's room to be flexible, you're flexible, but definitely not to the detriment of the student.
I understand, thank you.
If Jennifer, I would be interested in following up on the students after they take the training to see if they understand plagiarism, APA. So if you're still on the call, just contact me, and I would be happy to work with you on brainstorming on ideas to do that. Okay.
Definitely. Thank you for your interest. Okay. And that goes with, I saw a bunch of comments in the chat box that were about, supporting those students. And if anyone is interested in helping with the Writing Center, especially in the College of Business, we could definitely use some more help in the center. And it helps you to be more involved in supporting the students from that level, and from building them up and teaching them the skills for writing. So definitely reach out to me if you have any interest in that. And thank you, Professor Jenkins, for this great session today. This was fantastic. And
I think it was a great session, and I think we should have one person that kind of asks the students where they're coming from culturally, about that, where, in the Writing Center, get a baseline of what they're thinking in the beginning. I think I got that from this session. Thanks, Professor Jenkins.
Well, thank you, Professor Jenkins. I am going to write on the chat box 2 links. The first link is the professional development link for you to complete the information of this webinar into your professional development plan for Westcliff.
I think you muted yourself.
Okay, sorry. I just said that I'm going to write on the chat box a link for the professional development plan, if you like, that we have at Westcliff University. So for you to complete the information of this webinar into that link. And I'm going to also write a second link with the webinar survey, because we want to know what you thought of this webinar and other topics that you want us to discuss as faculty in upcoming webinars. So we want to hear from you. We want to listen to your recommendations. And for that, I'm going to also please, I'm going to put this link on the chat box, and please complete it as we finish this webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Professor Jenkins, for taking the time to discuss this so interesting topic. And well, for the rest of you, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you all.
So much,
Pleasure to meet you all.
Dr. Jenkins. Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you. Appreciate it.
We will send the links in to the emails as well, so you'll have that in case you didn't grab it here.
Good plan.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Take care.
Thank you all. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Very good work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Take care.